they do exist, then this is a perfectly adequate solution. It doesn't cost you anything, I don't think, and you can go for it. But that's if you're talking about enterprise, that's a fairly small number of people, because at the end of the day, if you're doing business and you want to conduct transactions, or you want to know who you're talking to at the other end, these public systems just aren't going to work. There are companies that sell what are called gateway solutions. A gateway basically is essentially a box that sits on your side of the firewall. You still are using the public IM systems. So you're using the clients. You've downloaded those, you're running those, but they're all pointing at this box. And this box is performing some kind of security on it. Initially, what they did is they did logging. That was the big thing. Hey, if we just know what you're saying, we'll be happy. We may not know who's saying it or who you're saying it to, or other people can see it or whatever, but we've written it all down. So that was the initial thing. Is just a place where they can log it. Now they're a little bit smarter. They can even bounce messages back into the organization if they know that the destination is not outside. They can do authentication against this thing and so on. So there is some. The gateways do provide some level of security. The most important thing that at least the enterprises believe is the auditing and logging capabilities, which is, from a regulatory view, it is important. Although unfortunately, some of the way these laws are written, they think that's all there is. I went to a health security conference, and all of the CSOs of these hospitals believed that everything was about auditing. They did this. It was kind of funny. They did this mock trial. And they basically had an employee who was doing backups, and she got a hold of the record of this mayor who was, in there for mental illness, and she decided she didn't like the mayor, so she was going to publish this information. And the mayor eventually committed suicide. So they were going to sue the hospital. The family was going to sue the hospital that this shouldn't have happened. Well, the whole thing was that they're saying that the discussion afterward, where the jury found the hospital not guilty. Gee, what a surprise. They were all in the healthcare business. They're CSOs for hospital. No, of course they didn't do anything wrong. But the afterward discussion was interesting because the whole discussion was around, if they had proper auditing, this wouldn't have happened. And I'm like, I'm scratching my head. I'm like, what do you mean, auditing? That who did it. That was the whole point of this mock trial. They told you it was this employee. She went and did it. She didn't even try to hide it. They're so worried about the way this HIPAA regulation is written about auditing that gets them off the hook that they completely forgot that if they secured the data in the first place, she wouldn't have been able to see what the data was, and she would never have been able to publish it. So sometimes we've got people focused on the wrong thing, and hence that's why logging was the first thing that came up with IM. It's because the regulations really focus a lot on auditing. It's an after-the-fact kind of thing, and it's kind of frustrating. And so when you go to the hospital, just keep that in mind. The best deployment, I believe, and certainly this works differently for different size companies, is going to be, an in-house deployment. IBM's same time is probably the poster child for an enterprise class IM in-house system. I guess Microsoft RTC is new to the market. They're going to, they're the next one, and we know what's going to happen there. But again, this is like for almost any application. This isn't really necessarily unique to IM, but it's going to give you the best control, the best security, and so on. And certainly, if you have an ID department and data center and all that stuff, this one makes the most sense. And we talk to a lot of companies, and they're like, we already have data center. That's sunk money. Putting this in-house is the only way we would even think of it. And certainly, when you're talking about the financial industries, that's where you start, and that's where you end. There is nothing else because they can't afford to have that data going anywhere. And the way most of these other systems work is when it hits the server at the hosted site, you don't even know if it's in the clear or not. You don't know who can see it. Often it is in the clear, by the way. And you have no idea who's looking at that stuff. You don't know how long that stuff's sitting. It's kind of like email. Except in this case, it's AOL, Microsoft, or Yahoo. But you don't know who's looking at that stuff. You don't know if somebody's copying that stuff onto tape or DVD or whatever it is kids use nowadays for that. But you don't know anything. That's the problem. Once it goes out of your firewall, you really have to take the word of the person of the hosted site about what's happening. And we all know that even if you own it yourself, you still don't know the people. I mean, this mock trial thing. This employee was a good employee. They had no reason to suspect her. She'd been an employee for like 15 years. you have no reason to suspect that she would ever do this. So you still don't. So that's why you have to protect the data, and you can do it in such a way that one person can never have that much control. That you would at least take a group of people to conspire against the company to get that data out. But when it goes out that firewall to these hosted solutions, you don't know what's happening. So those are the ones. So I'm getting close to the end here. The future. Well, email's pretty ugly nowadays. I mean, it's this spam thing is pretty out of control. I get an unbelievable amount of spam. It's kind of weird. About a year and a half or a year ago, whatever, I got no spam. And all of a sudden, somebody turned a switch on, and I get unbelievable amounts of spam now, to the point where I delete at least one real message every day while I try to clean out my box of stuff. And the mail I get is embarrassing. It's not the good kind of spam. At least if somebody saw it, they'd say, "Oh, that's spam. Isn't that cute?" Mine is like, I could go to jail. I think it's really bad. I don't know how I got on these lists, but it happened all of a sudden too. Competitors are not nice, but email is email is good for many things, and it still certainly has a place. I mean, people. It's going to be like for document delivery, it's for statement delivery and so on, where you're delivering documents. It doesn't matter if they're there or not. It's on push. It's just like regular mail, but using it for businessy transactions is becoming a bigger problem. Spam is an issue. Of course, we all know virus is an issue. The latest thing, of course, is phishing, spoofing stuff, where Citibank sends me a message telling me that the terms and conditions of my account have changed. I actually got one of these messages. Luckily, I was immediately tipped off because I'm not a Citibank customer. But I started looking at it, and I'm like, wow, this is a very well-formed spoof. I mean, it looks just like an authentic Citibank message. I saved it, and it's a hard problem to solve because Citibank had nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
And it's hard to educate. It's an education issue.
There was a bunch of. If you look at the headers on some of those mail messages, you notice they're coming out of Comcast, and Citibank just doesn't use Comcast as a relay point. And some of the early ones I saw came out of Czechoslovakia.
They're very clever.
What's the equivalent for doing something like that in instant messaging? How can you don't have headers that you can look at?
Well, in enterprise instant messaging, that's a good question. In enterprise class instant messaging, you can't just send a message to someone who didn't already allow you to send them a message. Okay, so I mean, not everyone is like this, but certainly there are many enterprise class messaging systems where, in order for me to send you a message, I have to invite you onto my list, and you have to agree.
But that's for public IM.
Okay, well, it didn't used to be, if that's the case now. Well, on your buddy list, I think that's true, but isn't it also true that I can just send somebody an IM and the window will pop up? What was that?
If I opted out, then you cannot.
Okay, so I know there was a time when that wasn't the case, so I'm not that close to the public IM systems, I admit that. But I know in an enterprise class one, there's that whole doesn't exist. Now, the other thing about enterprise class ones is everybody has to authenticate themselves just to connect. Mm-hmm. So you know who it is. You don't need to worry about headers and so on. There's an audit record of exactly who logged in, when, and in fact what they said if everything's being transcripted, right?
Well, how rigorous is the authentication? How do you really know?
Well, that depends on the system, right? That comes down to the I mean, that's a whole other. I gave a 2-hour talk on authentication, so that's a whole other thing. But that's really up to the enterprise vendor itself. Like AOL, their enterprise class one is based on digital certificates, but still it's a matter of how thorough was the issuance of the digital certificate, and they rely on VeriSign, to do that kind of stuff. Other enterprise class systems which are better for enterprise are ones that integrate with the enterprise directory services, right? And it's really up to them as far as how strong I want to make that authentication. And luckily, there are standards in that area. Speaking a little off topic, in authentication around SAML, Liberty Alliance, and so on, which allow you to integrate with other authentication mechanisms, and then you can basically set it up for as strong or weak as you want. You can allow third parties to authenticate, and then you just set up trust relationships with the third parties, and you say, I'm going to trust that they did a good job authenticating. Now, within your own enterprise, typically you already have a reasonably good authentication system, even if it's just logging into your Windows machine. Most employers are pretty careful about who they let in to log in, right? And that kind of stuff, even just to pick up your email. It's also also the norm as far as the strength of authentication is a username and password. But there are many companies now that are moving to much stronger forms of authentication, and certainly in the government, they're moving to better forms of authentication. But at the end of the day, it's up to the enterprise. And then there's an interesting issue: is if you're an enterprise and you're communicating with end users, how do I know it's really them, and who controls that authentication? That's a whole other topic. But it's an important part of the whole IAM experience if you're using this to communicate with people outside of your enterprise. So, I think IAM in the enterprise is being used for two places. One is internal usage, collaboration, productivity, and that stuff just internally, which is really what SameTime, for example, was meant to do. And then there's the idea of, and this is relatively new, of using IAM to communicate with people outside my customers. Not necessarily through the public IAMs, though. So I want to give them something that I control, I own, so they can authenticate against me, because I need to know it's really them. So, there's, like in the financial world again, since they're the ones who care the most about this, or even healthcare for that matter, they'll send, say, a statement out and have an IAM window in it, so that if you have a question about something on your statement, you can just type in a question, and it will go back to the enterprise, the organization that sent you the statement, and you can be communicating with somebody in customer support right away. I just had this on American Express bill. I got a duplicate billing. I saw the exact same thing was there twice. That couldn't be right. It would have been very nice just to say right there, duplicate billing on item 5, and have be talking to somebody. You could even be again a bot. It doesn't have to be a person right away. Instead, I had to pick up the phone, dial my 47-digit code, get through the menu, get to a person, and of course they ask me my account number again. That's the experience today. But if we were clever about, say, instant messaging, and this, you can only do this with secure instant messaging, then we can do this. It's much lower cost to them. It's a better user experience for the customer, and so on. So I think IAM is almost going to be forced upon us because of what's going on with email. Although email is never going to go away because it still has its use. And in fact, it could be used as a way to set up the IAM channel, just like IAM could be used as a way to set up an alternative communication channel. But when is IAM going to be as ubiquitous as email? That's the big question. Is when can I just IAM with anyone? And again, I think that's a ways out. And it's just too bad that we had an opportunity, it seems, to basically be designing these new protocols with security like baked in right from the ground up. And actually, for the first time ever, we even have some other standards groups that we could leverage in the hardest area, which is authentication. Authentication is by far the hardest part of security. And for a change, we actually have some standards that a bunch of companies are finally agreeing to with the SAML and the Liberty Alliance stuff. And Microsoft's the only one right now who's not really bought in. But everybody else is bought in. There are people developing products, and they're big companies, not little ones like us. There's big guys that are doing this. So it's just too bad that we didn't take advantage of that in designing these protocols. So I think that's going to be an issue for a while. I think presence is really going to be a killer application, but this is where we talk about invasion of privacy. I was talking about this earlier. It's kind of an interesting paradox. People keep saying presence is going to be this big thing, but presence is all about knowing where you are and what you're doing at all times. And yet we also talk a lot about privacy in this country, invasion of privacy, and so on. And here we are talking. Everyone's saying, yeah, presence is cool, and I want to know where you are, I want to tell you. But on the other hand, I want to keep my privacy. Well, it's going to be hard to get both those things. So it's going to be an interesting trade-off, and we'll see what happens with that. But right now, the cell phone vendors and all those guys are moving toward adding basically presence. Well, they already know, of course. When you turn your cell phone on, they certainly know where you are, who you are, and what you're doing. The question then is, are they going to release that data and how to the other systems? This is kind of like the AOL and Yahoo and so on. It's the same kind of problem, except really what they own is the presence data about your cell phones.
I want to argue about that because presence is only giving you some indication and